I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house and welcome to another slice of dark Disney, that strange phase in the 80s of Disney's history where through new CEO Ron Miller they were trying to push into slightly more adult and darker areas. Now we're grading on a scale here. Remember, this was back at a time when it got a little bit of a gasp that a Disney movie was given a PG rating, but out of all of the small clutch of dark phase movies we're going to be looking at, The Watcher in the Woods from 1980 is the one that is easily the most out and out horror of the lot. It was directed by John Huff, who had previously directed Twins of Evil for Hammer, something I've reviewed on this channel, and The Legend of Hell House, which I have yet to review. It has some great horror credentials to its name, and yet, even whilst I completely acknowledge that this is beloved to an awful lot of people, and I completely get it, this isn't a film that I saw, I think, at the right time. It never got under my skin, never got its hooks into me. So if it did for you and you haven't revisited it, perhaps best to leave it as a cherished childhood memory. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of really interesting things to pick out from this, and this is certainly a curate's egg from Disney. A very strange little dipping of the big toe into the horror waters to see if it's too hot, and perhaps thinking, yeah, it's a little bit too hot for our tastes. The setup is as classically English ghost story as you can possibly hope to get. An American family move into an old rural English house. On the grounds there is Mrs. Aylwood, the owner of the place, who will only rent the property out to people who meet her very specific specifications. We learn through the course of the film that many years previously Mrs. Aylwood's daughter went missing under very strange circumstances, and Jan, the eldest daughter of the family, who bears a striking resemblance to this missing daughter, feels constantly watched from a presence in the woods and becomes subject to some very strange occurrences. And there are some genuinely creepy things going on in this movie. Let me touch upon the locations. If you're going to have a ghost story set in England, you're going to want something special with regards to the architecture. And we're basically up to our necks in it if you care to look in this country. And The Watcher in the Woods does brilliantly. There's a couple of houses, there's a church setting, which Robert Wise had previously used in his 1963 film The Haunting, if you want an idea of where the bar is being set with regard to creepy architecture. The film's called The Watcher in the Woods, so naturally we're going to have to go into the woods, and the few times that we do, the way it's shot and lit, the woods are suitably eerie, suitably creepy, especially when it's backlit with fog, dry ice rolling in, and Jan is wandering around it, and you have the creeping, roaming POV camera of the Watcher. Very, very effective, if simple filmmaking techniques for a young kid watching at the time. Then you've got Jan in front of the mirror that is not reflecting her, and later on seeing reflections of a blindfolded girl in mirrors, and later on a myriad of her in a hall of mirrors she visits. All properly creepy stuff. There's a very, very effective scene where Jan almost drowns, and it looks for all the world as if Mrs. Aylwood is trying to actually kill her by holding her under the water. Jan is imperiled throughout the movie. There are shifty and vaguely threatening locals, grown-ups now who were childhood friends of this girl from around the time that she disappeared. But every moment of threat and peril in The Watcher in the Woods is instantly resolved, explained, and diffused. Nothing that could scare a young'un is left to remain scary for any period of time. Jan's strangely psychic, ill-defined connection with the Watcher and these visions of a blindfolded little girl afford her the opportunity and ability to make remarkably on-the-nose predictions, assumptions. The film tells constantly, especially through Jan's dialogue. It doesn't show. It speaks to perhaps a wariness on behalf of Disney. I think probably acutely aware that they're entering into a territory that is outside their wheelhouse, that they don't seem to be able to trust the viewer to bring them along. So the character of Jan is left telling us an awful lot of things that she intuits rather than us finding out with her. Jan is played by Lynn Holly Johnson, who, if you're a Bond fan like me, you'll know her as the ice skater from For Your Eyes Only. And so if you're a Bond fan like me, you'll understand that she'll be just fine in this movie. Jan's younger sister Ellie is played by Kyle Richards, who we will all know as little Lindsay Wallace from Halloween, John Carpenter's Halloween, not the new one, although she's going to be in the next one. And Kyle gives a really grating performance, just one level too loud all the time, and she stays on that sonic level, but is pretty much worth it for what is probably the most English put down I've ever seen in a movie. Check it out.
How comforting to know we're the right sort of people.
I've seen the iciest of old ladies melted by your charm.
I think it was your daughter who did the trick.
Me?
No, dear, not you.
Now that's the equivalent of an English person saying, I fucking hate you. I think you're awful. The poor parents are played by Carol Baker and David McCallum, and unfortunately they are given, to all intents and purposes, nothing to do. But we do have the imperious Bette Davis as Mrs. Aylward. And even a winging it Bette Davis is absolutely mesmerising and worth watching. And here she glides around the movie being creepy and scary as needed, bringing the goods when we need her to bring the goods. And if you thought that the last put down was good, just let's see Bette Davis saying exactly the same thing pretty much, but with no dialogue, just a look.
My husband would like to talk to you about the details of the lease. That is, if you've decided to let us live here.
I'm going to take a chance on you.
Absolutely withering. If you saw this film as a kid and loved it and still love it, I totally get it. That is completely understandable. I just personally think it could have done with a wee bit more sustained threat, a little bit more of a comprehensive mystery for Jan to investigate, sort of like Nancy Drew, rather than just bits and bobs and things happening. Oh, now something happens at a motorbike rally, now something happens with the horses, and occasionally she'll get a flash of inspiration and go off and do the next thing. And the sort of exposition through dialogue is at its absolute worst at the ending of the movie. We find out, spoilers for the ending of Watcher in the Woods, that the Watcher is an alien entity who sort of dimensionally shifted with this daughter who disappeared at a period of lunar eclipse many years ago, and she needs those conditions to be recreated so that they can get back to their own dimension and the daughter can come back trapped and frozen in time where she got sent. In the theatrical version, young Ellie, Kyle Richards, is possessed by this Watcher who is a sort of floaty energy ribbon who, using her as a mouthpiece, explains pretty much everything. We have a poor test screening, apparently a disastrous test screening, to thank for this really ham-fisted ending. There are two alternate endings. You can find them here on YouTube, and I will link to them, which are far more nutso and apparently a little bit too much for the tiny minds of the people who went to the test screening for the first time. All the particulars remain the same in the first alternate ending. Just to see this horror notion, there's a lot more talk about witchcraft and potential possession before we see the Watcher, who's not a family-friendly sort of ball of energy, but is an adult-sized marionette insectoid winged bat-type alien that enfolds Jan in its wings and just poof disappears. leaving Jan's mum to appear in the abandoned church, and like history repeating itself, her daughter's disappeared and she's desperate and struggling and trying to get someone to tell her what happened to my daughter. There's a third alternate ending whereby much of this is the same, except it goes even weirder and we get to see Jan and the creature in the alternate dimension briefly. If a little bit more money had been sunk into that, they might have kept it. It's so weird and so nuts. But you know me by now, I do like my weird, I do like my nuts and my gonzo. Personal preference, the first alternate ending without the visit to the alien dimension is very effective. The creature is pretty nasty. Yeah, it's obviously a puppet, but come on, what do you want? And then there is actually this sustained period of a good number of minutes where Jan has actually been taken. And for the first time, in the alternate version that didn't make the film, there's a sense of sustained threat and peril and danger. So I personally wish that they'd stuck it out. I know the reshoots were by a different director. John Huff didn't oversee any of that, and he thinks that his film got filleted at the very end, cut off at the knees. I wish they'd kept the insane insectoid alien, but they didn't, for better or for worse. But the next movie we're going to look at in this little dark Disney miniseries kept its incredibly famous, infamous, notorious, completely whacked out ending absolutely intact. Join me for The Black Hole.